And I think the universities are revealing in this regard. I mean, the universities are where the left speaks frankly, because they completely run the universities. Now, oddly enough, this is what is most amusing, and I laugh because there is no institutions in the history of humanity that are more woke than our universities, and yet students and the faculty are convinced that these universities are infected with racism. Which is just, I mean, if you look at it from the outside, it's ludicrous. I mean, if there is one place you are not going to find traditional racism of the white supremacy variety in America today, it's at our elite universities.
Right.
And yet they're in a constant state of hysteria over, this is racist and this is racist.
What is woke capitalism in the eyes of David Azerrad? Why are large corporations now taking stances on highly controversial topics that they would have previously avoided? Why does Azerrad think that the radical left has actually abandoned its push for egalitarian utopia? And what does he see as the way out of the culture wars in America today? This is American Thought Leaders, and I'm Jan Jekielek. In this episode, we'll sit down with David Azerrad, an assistant professor and research fellow at Hillsdale College. Previously, he was a fellow at the Heritage Foundation and director of the B Kenneth Simon Center for Principles and Politics.
David Azerrad, so great to have you back on American Thought Leaders.
Thank you for having me again, Jan.
David, you've been recently speaking about this topic, which I find really fascinating. It's been described as woke capitalism. It really caught my attention with the reports of this, this Gillette commercial, right? Which, of course, espousing, attacking toxic masculinity.
And then promoting transgenderism.
Promoting transgenderism, really. And that resulting in apparently, a big financial loss for Gillette. This is what I've been following. And it struck me as an incredibly odd thing for a large company to commit to, right, ideologically. And this is so you've been talking about woke capitalism. What's going on here?
And I'm glad it struck you as odd, because it is odd. What sort of a business takes sides in the most divisive, polarizing cultural battles of the age? I mean, common sense you would think would say, avoid these, right? Michael Jordan famously said in the 1990s, Republicans buy sneakers too. That's why he sat out, in this particular case, was endorsing a Democrat who was running against Jesse Helms' seat in North Carolina. Whereas today, it seems to be the very opposite, that they seem eager to jump in these divisive issues. So the Gillette ads, there were two of them, one on toxic masculinity, one on transgenderism, Nike supporting Colin Kaepernick and therefore indirectly the Black Lives Matter movement, Ben & Jerry's put out resistance theme ice cream. I've lost track of the number of major corporations that filed amicus briefs to support gay marriage or to call Trump's so-called Muslim ban unconstitutional. So we're seeing this phenomenon of major corporations going woke, taking sides on the social justice wars. And it seems to not make sense because you would think that it would hurt their bottom line. But the truth of the matter is that you don't really go broke if you go woke.
Okay.
And I think that the main reason I would say is that conservatives generally do not mobilize as consumers. Okay. They mobilize as voters, they will mobilize as activists, as volunteers. But on the whole, big business is not afraid of them because they don't have a distinguished track record of boycotting. The left does. And then add to that this rather strange dynamic that, generally speaking, the right continues to view big business as a friend, even though they're not. They are more likely to be big friends of the left, but the left continues to view big business as the enemy. And therefore, big business is not particularly keen on currying favor with the right, but is rather eager to do so with the left. So in the case of Gillette, there have been, I read reports that sales went down after that ad, but then I read other stories saying that this may be due to an overall decline in shaving. I mean, Look at me here today, right? Men have this gruffy look that is taking over. But what we generally have not found is that the corporations, like Nike, didn't seem to pay a price for the Colin Kaepernick ads, and that it seems to it does not affect their business, their bottom line as businesses, and therefore they continue to do it.
So you're saying basically on one hand they're kind of currying favor with one side of the argument and getting the support, but there's no cost on the other end. So hey, everyone can just go all in on this.
And they're also afraid of one side in a way that they're not. I think that, look, the left runs America. All of the elite institutions understand that power in America politically resides with the left, by which I don't necessarily mean the Democratic Party. I just mean the pieties of the left. And so sure, Republicans win elections, but the enforcers of what we're allowed to think and say, that is really done by the left in America, not by the right. I mean, you can insult the pieties of the right as much as you want. You're very unlikely to lose your job, be deplatformed, be doxxed, be demonized, and be boycotted. It's really as if you cross the pieties of the left that they come after you hard. And so therefore, I think businesses understand that they need to be careful and that there's much value in this performative wokeness. Running an ad, donating to a particular cause, sending a signal that you're on board with this. I don't even necessarily believe that the people who are running the corporations, every last one of them, actually agree with this. I think it may just be, paying protection money to the mafia. Leave me alone.
Okay.
So I will, fly the gay flag for Gay Pride Month. I will do an ad about Black Lives Matter, and in exchange, you leave me alone to run my business.
So somewhere along the way, I don't even know how old this movement is in the corporate sense. Like can you give me do you have a historical sense of where this kind of started, or maybe
I don't have a precise one.
Yeah.
I would say it's not a very old phenomenon. I mean, the term itself was coined by Ross Douthat of the New York Times, who wrote a really wonderful column in February of 2008 called The Rise of Woke Capital, in which he started describing the phenomenon. The phenomenon itself is not that old. I would say a decade maybe. I mean, what businesses used to do, and I think you'll remember this, was corporate social responsibility.
Yes.
So they also wanted to signal that they were just not greedy big corporations, that they were good corporate citizens. But corporate social responsibility is about, sponsoring a little league,
Right.
minor league baseball team.
Not controversial things,
That's
basically.
it. If anything,
Okay,
you
yeah.
avoid controversy. Yeah. So you clean up a park, you invest in a school, you do an after-school program for disadvantaged kids. This is different. This, like I said, is you're taking sides in the polarizing issues. I would say the last 5 to 10 years, and that it's part of this broader phenomenon that has been dubbed the Great Awakening.
Okay.
We saw beginning in 2012, 2013, that elite white liberals in America, white liberals with college degrees, moved to the left very rapidly and very aggressively on a host of cultural and identity issues, to the point where they are to the left, for example, or of racial minorities on affirmative action. They are to the left of immigrants on immigration questions. And so I would view this as part of a broader phenomenon that we've seen an intensification of the cultural wars in the last few years. What exactly causes it is complicated, and I don't think there's a definitive answer. I would say it's probably a combination of Twitter reaching a critical mass.
Okay.
And Twitter is very good at allowing you to withdraw into a bubble of, on the one hand, hearing about outrage, and on the other hand, having your biases confirmed
Yes.
by people who agree with you. I also think the re-election of Barack Obama created a sense of history is on our side. The very quick victory on gay marriage, I think the left was probably to some degree surprised at how rapidly a Obergefell happened, and it further emboldened them. They didn't react with magnanimity by saying, okay, we won a big battle in the cultural war, let's now be magnanimous and generous. Instead, they set out, on the one hand, to go after the holdouts, the Christian bakers, florists, and photographers, who did not want to be involved in gay marriages. They were serving gay people and in certain cases hiring them. They just said, we don't want to be involved in the ceremony. And then they were persecuted, in some cases put out of business by the left. And then the other thing they did was to pick up the transgender rights issue and present it as, of course, the new civil rights issue of the day, and press that one very aggressively, and we're still seeing that happening right now. And then add to that the victory of Trump, which sent them in a tailspin because they processed that as, the Third Reich is coming to America, which is completely silly. I mean, you can criticize Donald Trump for a variety of reasons, but to suggest that he's a fascist, I think, is just ludicrous. So we've seen in the past, like I said, beginning maybe 2012, 2013, this great awakening that is playing out across the board in the culture, and one manifestation of it is woke capitalism.
I'm trying to imagine, you think that mostly these companies are simply just doing this because it's actually helpful to the bottom line and there's no cost. Is there any other...
I think it's a variety of factors. I think some of the level-headed CEOs, like I said, view it as a cost of doing business. That even if it's small, it affects the bottom line a little bit, it's the cost of doing business to be left alone in other regards. Because remember, this allows you to really run your for-profit corporation and to make a lot of money and to stave off demands that you pay your workers more, that you be more heavily regulated, that maybe your monopoly be broken off. It doesn't cost them much to support Signal for Black Lives Matter or gay pride.
On the surface of it, to me, looking at the leadership of some companies, looking at some of the strong voices from some of these companies, it seems to me like there's the value system that's associated with the wokeness is in there. It's
so
not
that's
just
the other
purely,
dimension.
Okay.
So some of them, I think, don't believe in it and just think that, look, you sacrifice to Baal to be left alone. But I also think, look, who runs our big businesses? Who works in them? People who go to college. What are our universities in America today? They're indoctrination centers for identity politics that teach you to see racism, sexism, and homophobia everywhere. So I think that in some cases, the leadership actually believes this. And in other cases, even if they don't, there's pressure internally from the employees to signal that you're woke on the right issues. So it's a way to respond to internal pressure. The millennials who work in the corporation who are adamant that the business be more committed to the right causes. And so you do that. But again, you'll notice that they're always going woke on cultural issues, not on the Bernie Sanders agenda.
Okay.
So, they're not calling for a higher minimum wage, more taxation, stringent enforcement of the Sherman Act to break up monopolies. They placate the social justice identity left so as to not have to deal with the democratic socialist left of Bernie Sanders in particular, also Elizabeth Warren. That wing of the left, I think, is not taken in by the performative wokeness. They want more taxes, more regulations. They hate big business. So, it points to this split on the left over what is the moral center of gravity.
Okay.
Is it solidarity with the poor, the working class, and the middle class, which is what the left used to be? In which case, you just don't like big business. Or is it what the left has become, which is solidarity with women, people of color, the LGBTQ, illegal aliens, you name it. And that identitarian left is really agnostic when it comes to capitalism. There is no necessary opposition to it. They just want to make sure that the capitalists are committed to diversity. But there's a way to do that that doesn't hurt the bottom line, which is you hire a sprinkling of women and minorities and you put them in the C-suite, you celebrate Gay Pride Month, and then otherwise you're left alone to run your business.
Fascinating. That's very interesting. I've never heard it put quite like that. So before we go even deeper, you were talking about the culture wars, a little bit earlier. And I don't necessarily think that everyone watching kind of understands what you mean by that. I think I understand, but can you break that down a little bit?
I don't know that I have a precise definition of it, but I view it as the phenomenon we've been witnessing now in America for some time of everything being politicized. Sports are politicized, religion is politicized, politics has obviously always been politicized. Business becomes politicized, education becomes politicized, and you open up fights not on these technocratic issues of, how do we regulate the banks or what is the right taxation rate, but you go to issues affecting identity, sex, sexuality, the family, religion, things that cut very close to the home. And one side, generally the left, takes a pretty intransigent position, says that everyone who disagrees with them is either a racist, a sexist, a homophobe, the worst person in the world. You impugn their motives. And you try to drive them out of the public square and get them to capitulate and impose your views on them. So I think the alternative to the culture wars would be a live and let live ethos, which, by the way, the left used to preach in the 1960s, interestingly enough, when they were not in power. So the culture wars are, look, we're a very big country. We're a country of 330 million people with a lot of ethnic, religious, geographic diversity.
Right.
We're not going to agree on everything. We never have, and we never will. We need to agree on certain core things, that we're all Americans, we're all in this together, we should all believe in the rule of law, be faithful to the Constitution. But we have a system that is designed to accommodate an awful lot of disagreement on these issues where we don't agree.
It was in fact created to
Exactly.
do that, right?
Yeah,
Yes, yes.
federalism is a synonym for political diversity. It means that Vermont gets to be Vermont, Texas gets to be Texas. And if you're not happy, you move, or you get involved in Vermont and you try to make it red, or you try to make Texas blue. But I view the cultural wars as being started by the left and about saying, here is the right answer on all of these issues, and we're going to impose them on every last county in the country.
So there's a certain kind of, this is a kind of authoritarianism you're talking about. Basically, right?
It's a very intolerant form of politics that really escalates everything to DEFCON 1. Everything is an existential life or death issue. The other people have the worst possible motives. They're no longer your fellow citizens who may reasonably disagree about any number of issues, and you go after them very hard. So it's an intolerant, fanatical development in our politics that makes it very hard for us to get along as fellow Americans. And I should add, I think it's just exhausting. There's a dimension of, it's just very tiring to live in America and follow the general culture, because it's one hysterical, it's not even a scandal, one hysterical overreaction to the next about things that you could say, this is either not that big of a deal, or it's a small local problem, why are we discussing it nationally? Or, okay, some people think this way, others think this way.
So, but isn't, what strikes me as we're talking here, isn't this just kind of part of this strategy? If you would want to impose these values, just kind of tire people out by just pushing it. Yeah. Eventually, you get tired, right?
Yeah. One of the things that I'm disappointed of with myself is I don't get as outraged as I used to when I hear about a whole bunch of things, because I've kind of recalibrated my expectations downwards. And I've come to accept that there's a fair amount of corruption across the board, that there's a lack of justice when it comes to many things, that I should no longer expect that in America we treat people according to the content of their character or their skills, but it more and more is based on the color of their skin. And so when something happens that you would think fundamentally clashes and violates with core American principles, and I suspect many others have a tendency, not all the time, but to shrug our shoulders and say, okay, this is the America we live in. And they kind of wear you down that way, and this allows their agenda to advance.
This is tied. Some weeks ago I interviewed Dennis Prager around his new film, the film that he is in, No Safe Spaces, which focuses on this, assault on free speech. Again, there's a certain way of thinking. If your thinking isn't like this, then we're going to prevent your speech because it's wrong.
Because it's hateful.
Right.
Because this is hate speech. So it no longer is, oh, well, we're disagreeing politically. I mean, political speech is supposed to be contentious. Now, I want to make one thing clear for your viewers is they may say, well, why are you in favor of hate speech? Hate speech is not about using the N-word or denying the Holocaust. The way that the left understands hate speech is in a pretty expansive way, which is, well, if I call for less immigration or for the deportation of illegals, they will brand that as hate speech. In Europe, if you raise concerns about the scale of Muslim immigration and the ability of the countries to process and assimilate this many people from a very foreign culture, you get branded as promoting hate speech. So it really is a way to circumscribe political discourse. It's a way to silence opponents because you can pretty much label anything hateful. I mean, they are fond of saying,
Right.
I mean, you know the accusation, we use dog whistles. So if I tell you, Jan, I believe that the welfare system in America is not well structured, they'll say, oh, that's a racist dog whistle. That's some way of signaling that you don't want poor black people to receive money. I said no such thing. I made no mention of race. I think the welfare system is poorly structured for all recipients, white, black, and yellow. So you attack the person, and thankfully, America is the only Western nation that has not criminalized hate speech, thanks to the First Amendment. And the Supreme Court has been solid on this, but the winds are blowing in one direction, which is in Canada and in Europe. All of these countries have criminalized hate speech, and they use that aggressively again, not to ban hateful racial insults, but to circumscribe political discourse on contentious issues.
Right. There was, I don't know if you saw this, but I remember seeing...
Zustimmen. Aber die Meinungsfreiheit kennt Grenzen. Und die beginnen da, wo gehetzt wird, da, wo Hass verbreitet wird. Die beginnen da, wo die Würde anderer Menschen verletzt wird. Und dagegen werden und müssen wir uns stellen in diesem Hause. Und das werden wir auch hinbekommen, meine Damen und Herren. Denn sonst ist diese Gesellschaft nicht mehr das, was sie glauben.
Well, I should add quickly in passing, whether or not this is of interest to your viewers, you can decide, but free speech properly understood does have limits. So the founders, for example, in drafting the First Amendment, did not consider that obscenity was a form of speech. And America has had a long history of regulating and banning obscene speech. So I think according to the standards of the founders, pornography is not a protected form of speech. There's also defamatory speech that you
Right.
can be liable for, seditious libel, trying to actively overthrow the United States government. So speech does have limits, and I think we should all be respectful and courteous to our fellow citizens. We shouldn't insult them gratuitously. That being said, if we are going to live in a free country, we're going to disagree about issues. And you can't just label everyone who disagrees with you hateful. You need to be willing to tolerate disagreements on all of the issues, on what marriage is, on when life begins, on what we should do about immigration. I mean, this is what it means to live in a free society. We disagree.
And one would argue that, you can come up with better ideas by having these disagreements and having legitimate, thoughtful debates where you actually care to, or is it just that it's already decided and there's no need for discussion anymore? What do you think the road is from this place of, wokeness, which is now, kind of captivating almost every aspect of society, I think, almost by definition, as you were describing earlier?
That is a very difficult question to answer. I mean, you're asking me, how would I, as a modest conservative in America, propose that we win the culture wars? I would offer two broad suggestions. One is we need to break or deal a blow to the institutional centers of power of wokeness. And first and foremost are the universities. The current setup is insane. They're nonprofits. We subsidize people to go there. They are overwhelmingly, they've basically abdicated the majority of them their pedagogical function. I mean, they're about indoctrination and credentialing.
And this is in
not
humanities, just to be
about
clear.
the humanities, the social sciences, and more importantly, the university administrations themselves.
Okay.
So yes, maybe the hard sciences have been left alone, although Heather McDonald has been chronicling the rise of wokeness even in the hard sciences. So I think we need to do something about the university system, whereas right now in America, if you want to get ahead and be successful, you need to go to a school, preferably a good school. If you go there, you will be indoctrinated into anti-American identity politics. We, the taxpayers, are subsidizing all of this. Something needs to be done about this. Now, I am a small L liberal. I do not believe that the government should close universities or harm them, but two things should be done to them. One is, I think the charlatanism should be exposed, that they should be mocked and humiliated and called out. I think that what President Trump did to the media, he and others should do to the elite universities. They are no longer in the business of educating, they're in the business of credentialing and indoctrinating. They're corrupt. You see it in the admissions. I always tell this to my foreign friends, who are very impressed by the big elite universities in America. And I tell them that you realize to get into these schools, it helps to have good scores, but it also helps to have the right skin color, the right sexual orientation, to be involved in some sort of activity, to have parents who went there, to have grandparents who went there, to have parents who donate to that university. Our universities do not have a meritocratic admission system. The French do. The Chinese, as best as I can tell, do. We don't. It's a combination of meritocracy, and then I think it's a form of corruption to say that the fact that your parents are donating money to the university or that they went there and that you should be allowed in. So I think we need to do something about the universities that are the R&D department for wokeness. They're the indoctrination centers for wokeness, and they need to be checked. The other thing we need to do is, I think we need to compel the left to moderate itself. We need to stand up more forcefully to the bullying. I think conservatives need to realize that many of us believe in live and let live, but the only way we're going to have live and let live is if we compel those who right now refuse to live and let live to live and let live. And so we need to stand up to the bullies on the left. We need to mobilize in a better way. We need more examples of leaders. Tucker Carlson, for example, who was, accused in a bogus way of being a racist. And he didn't bow down and he didn't apologize. And I think this teaches his fellow Americans a lesson in courage, that we will not all the time capitulate when you throw at us these ludicrous accusations. We're not, of course, dealing with real racism here. There's no tolerance for that in America, nor should there be. These gratuitous, nasty accusations that are thrown left and right. Conservatives need to develop a spine. They need to learn to stop apologizing, and they need to learn to have the back of those who are pilloried for violating one of the woke pieties of the age.
So we've been discussing this, called this as a culture war, right? But you're saying basically the left holds all the cards right now.
Yeah, and I want to make clear, when I say the left, I don't mean everyone who calls himself a liberal, and I definitely don't mean everyone who votes for the Democratic Party. I mean the hard left. I mean the people who are driving the train. And what worries me is that reasonable liberals and Democrats are generally afraid of them and don't stand up to them. And many conservatives are also afraid of them and don't stand up to them. So I'm not suggesting that 51% of the country believes this or is on board with this. I'm just saying there is a nucleus of zealots who are pushing this hard left cultural agenda on the country. They're ensconced in many powerful institutions, and people are afraid of them. And I understand why people are afraid of them. Because the way we destroy people in America today is not by sending them to the gulag. We call them a racist, we deplatform them, we get them fired from their job, and then the internet for the rest of your life, when we are Googled, will say, oh, this person has been accused of racism by CNN and NPR, and a couple of, court conservatives piled on and said, yes, that person is a racist and we need to get rid of them. So there is a fanatical element in our public life that needs to be defeated, and moderated to set the stage for the reemergence of, I think, normal political disagreements.
You know, another thing that just struck me as a sort of a side effect of this is that the actual racists out there, which certainly do exist,
of course,
you know, it's kind of like you're taking this whole group of people and you're kind of lumping them in with the people who have who could be the actual issue. And this is a very dangerous game to play, right?
Yeah, and we also need to distinguish, I would define a racist as someone who believes in the biological and moral superiority of certain races. That certain races are superior and therefore other races are inferior, and therefore not all human beings have the same rights. Such people do exist. You'll find them, in the fever swamps of the internet. They have no institutional power in America. They are completely maligned by the left, by the right, by the mainstream, and are given no voice, like I said, outside of the fever swamps of the internet. What the left and general culture has come to mean by racism is any statement about minorities that elite white liberals find offensive on their behalf. So you remember the brouhaha over the Washington Redskins?
Yes.
The team had to change the name of the Redskins because it's racist. Who had decided that Washington Redskins was racist? It was not Native Americans. From what I can tell, they quite liked the term and they thought that it depicted them in a manly way. No, it was elite white liberals who had suddenly decided that this was racist. So you run through the gamut of issues according to the standards of today's left. I mean, everything's racist and everyone's a racist. I mean, in America, we have a racial hierarchy that the so-called oppressed races are good and noble, and that the oppressor white race is evil. And we have set up a system that the laws do not allow you to discriminate. So the 1964 Civil Rights Act is meant to be colorblind. But the practice is there is discrimination in America. Just look at our universities. There is obvious discrimination in hiring and in admissions against not black people or women or the LGBT, but against white people, men, and Asians, who are discriminated against all the time, and the system permits this.
And why do you think the Asians? I mean, there's been, I've read different
this is not my area of expertise, but they score generally very well on standardized tests, and they are therefore need a much higher threshold to get admitted to a university than people of other racial groups would. It seems that the universities do not want to have too many Asian students. And so there's a lawsuit going on right now that I'm very interested to see how will play out.
Right.
A group of Asian students are suing Harvard University on the grounds that they are being discriminated against because of Harvard's admission policies that are not strictly meritocratic and do not only look at test scores and, so they want a holistic approach. A holistic approach ends up being a cover for discriminating on the basis of race. Who we discriminate against has changed, but we still discriminate. And I think that there's a general consensus amongst reasonable Americans of all races that ideally we would not, and that MLK's vision in the I Have a Dream speech would be the standard that we all follow, being well aware that we'll fall short in oftentimes because human beings are flawed and prejudiced, but that should be the ideal.
So, you mentioned a little bit earlier, the distinction between the old left, which was focused on class, right, and the new left, which is focused on identity.
Yes.
It always strikes me as being, kind of fundamentally I guess, Marxist in approach. Right? This approach of, I don't know, creating an egalitarian, a hyper-egalitarian society through some measure, like whether it's class, equalize everything, right, or through identity, right?
I don't know how egalitarian the contemporary woke left is.
This is my question. Is it the same? Is it likewise that way?
So look, the rhetoric on the surface is generally kumbaya, peace and love, building a more inclusive and tolerant democracy. Isn't it better to love than to hate? Why can't we all get along? And Benetton ads from the 1990s of people of all skin colors getting along and living harmoniously together. The reality of it, if you look at the policies they pursue, if you look at what the tenured academics who do not need to go before the American people to be elected or re-elected say, there's actually quite a lot of animosity towards particular groups, white people and men primarily. And as I said, a fair amount of discrimination against these groups in certain sectors of life. So it seems to me that the old egalitarian left has abandoned this commitment, and that there are now good groups, those who have been and claim to still be oppressed, women, people of color, LGBTQ, the undocumented, the roster is ever growing. And then there are bad groups, white people, men, Christians, the deplorables who live in flyover country. And there seems to be not much sympathy for them, and in many cases, quite a lot of animosity towards them.
Right.
So, the language on the surface of identity politics is quite deceptive because it presents itself as being about love and inclusivity, but it's actually quite divisive and promoting hatred just against certain groups.
So this isn't cultural Marxism, as I've heard it described.
I'm not crazy about that term. There are clearly echoes of Marx in our left today, namely the division of society between the oppressors and the oppressed.
Yes.
The concept of false consciousness still exists. Like people will say, well, how is it that, many African Americans do not agree with the professors at the university about race? Oh, well, they're deluded, right? They've been tricked into thinking that they're free and that America is a land of opportunity, but in fact, they're not.
Right.
We know better. That being said, the Marxist belief in history with a capital H, the dialectical materialism, even the promise of a utopia seems to have been the so-called scientific dimension of Marxism has disappeared. I mean, it was never really there because if there was one thing that Marxism was not as a science, but it claimed to be scientific. That has disappeared, and it seems to me that the old Marxist believed in the end of history more than the identitarian woke left does. I mean, you see it in Marx's writing, and there was a sense that one day the communist utopia would arrive.
Yes.
Whereas I find that the woke left, Ta-Nehisi Coates is revealing in this regard. He's America's leading authority on racial questions, at least he's treated that way. His is not a vision of reconciliation and the ability to transcend the past. His is an argument that America is fundamentally and irredeemably racist, and that we should struggle and fight, but with no hope of making things any better. So
do you think he would agree with that?
Well, that's the message of his book, Between the World and Me. It's a letter he wrote to his son, and the basic message is America's racist, it's never going to change, you should struggle and fight, but you should really abandon any hope that you will be capable of, as he puts it, raising your body to equality with that of your countrymen, I believe is, don't quote me on this, even though I just quoted him, I think that may be the sentence. So there's a bleak, pessimistic strain to the identitarian left that was absent from the old Marxist left. There was a utopian side to Marxism. It was very much part of the appeal.
But correct me if I'm wrong here, but isn't the whole purpose of this, dividing people up this way and so forth and giving privileges to the people that are, subjugated and so forth to create this utopia?
Like I said, yes and no. There are, the closer you get to the electorate, the more kumbaya the rhetoric is. Because no one's going to get elected on a platform of white people are evil, America is fundamentally racist, and I want to give special privileges to certain racial, sexual, ethnic groups and not to others.
I've been seeing that a lot of that said publicly.
So
lately.
It gets said by intellectuals, it gets said by professors, it gets said by journalists, by activists. But the people who are running for office couldn't say them, and you'd be unelectable on such a platform. So they may then enact policies that slightly point in that direction or go down that route, or in some cases more than slightly, actively do. But one should be, like I said, one should distinguish the, at times, in many cases, inclusive kumbaya rhetoric of identity politics from the uglier reality of the policies and the franker rhetoric that comes from intellectuals and academics.
Okay.
And I think the universities are revealing in this regard. I mean, the universities are where the left speaks frankly because they completely run the universities. Now, oddly enough, this is what is most amusing, and I laugh because there is no institutions in the history of humanity that are more woke than our universities, and yet students and the faculty are convinced that these universities are infected with racism. Which is just, I mean, if you look at it from the outside, it's ludicrous. I mean, if there is one place you are not going to find traditional racism of the white supremacy variety in America today, it's at our elite universities.
Right.
And yet they're in a constant state of hysteria over, this is racist and this is racist.
You were talking about this bleak picture that's, painted within the movement, in this sort of identity politics, let's call it, space. But what you're describing, I think, for people that aren't with that system, maybe the conservatives, that also feels like a pretty bleak picture.
What do you mean?
Well, like, you've made some suggestions on the way out. Fix the universities is one of them, right? But it feels like a really tall order at this point. Right?
Look, I'm not going to lie to you. I think we're in bad shape. I think that the country is deeply divided. I take solace in two things. One is we have not reached the point of political violence, which we have in our past. I mean, obviously the Civil War is the worst example, but then also the 1960s and 70s had political violence, which we thankfully, with the exception of Antifa, which admittedly is a big exception, but it's a somewhat contained phenomenon right now. Andy No may disagree with me. It hasn't reached that point yet. And then I draw some hope from the fact that I think that by and large, majorities of Americans are much more reasonable on a host of these questions than the talking heads on television are.
Right.
And that gives me some hope, but I'm not going to lie to you. I do worry about the state of the country, about the rhetoric, about the polarization, about the politicization of every single aspect of life. To go back to what we were talking about with woke capitalism, I don't want conservative capitalism. I would just want neutral capitalism. Sell me your jeans, run an ad that will lie to me and tell me that if I buy them, all the women will love me. But don't take sides on marriage, on abortion, on immigration, on politics. It would be nice to depoliticize many realms of life. If I want to watch a football game, maybe I just want to watch a football game. I don't need virtue signaling about a variety of causes. I just want to check out, have politics be politics. And maybe the rest can be, let religion be religion, business be business, and sports be sports.
One thing I was just reminded of as I was reading, I saw a tweet, I think today or earlier the other day, about a film director. He's saying, I'm not advocating for anything. There's this film director on Twitter, and he's saying, I'm not advocating for anything, but if Trump wins in 2020, there's going to be serious violence from Antifa.
Well, there already has been serious violence from Antifa, so let's not minimize that. I mean, go to Portland, speak to Andy No, who suffered a serious beating and was robbed by the thugs of Antifa. So we have had violence. But what happens if Trump wins again? He does not win the popular vote again. This will now be the third time in the 20th century that the left or the Democrats have lost a presidential election, even though they won the popular vote.
Right.
They've already are at DEFCON 1 with Trump being in office right now. And then imagine if Ruth Bader Ginsburg passes away, or if a justice on the Supreme Court decides to step down. I mean, look at what happened with Kavanaugh.
Right.
It could get worse. I really pray that it will not. I don't relay these scenarios to, there are some people who speak of accelerationism and they want to hasten the coming civil war. This is not at all my view. I worry about these things, and I don't have comforting words that it's all going to be okay. I don't know how this will turn out. I have some modest hopes that we can de-escalate things. But it will require that the right fight back more than it has, which I realize sounds paradoxical. If someone is on the left, will say, well, you sound like a partisan hack. You're saying that the way to win the culture war is for one side to fight more. I mean, that's not how you win a war. But I would say, well, yes, actually, wars are won by defeating an enemy. And the enemy in this case is not every American who doesn't vote the way I want them to vote or who supports different views. Like I said, it's this contingent of zealot leftists who are embedded in elite institutions around the country and pushing an aggressive, intolerant social justice agenda on everyone else.
Okay, David Azerrad, such a pleasure to speak with you.
The pleasure is all mine. Thank you, Jan.